So, good afternoon. I thought I'd start by explaining my somewhat ambiguous and I dare say potentially pessimistic sounding title for a 3D symposium that's supposed to be promoting 3D printing. But please be assured that as an active member of the Austin's 3D Med Lab and as a lead investigator of 3D printing for anaesthesia education, both here and at the Eastern Health, I'm heavily biased. I think 3D printing is very good. And if anyone leaves my talk feeling otherwise, please come see me afterwards. We'll have a bit of a spirit circle and we'll get all the bad and ugly out of you. But the research that we're completing both here and at Eastern Health involves creating 3D anatomical models for training and upkeeping skills in medical procedures. We champion the idea that 3D printing is an economically viable and option for producing teaching models and can offer improved teaching models compared to what's currently commercially available. So we've printed neuroaxial trainers, which we introduced into our training program this year. We've also developed ultrasound teaching models for teaching regional anaesthesia education. And we're continuing our work in creating and developing airway teaching models, as well as looking at ways to replicate the look and feel of human tissue using 3D printing analogues. So as part of that research, we expanded the setup of our 3D printing lab to have a 3D printer at the anaesthetic department of Box Hill Hospital. And we began printing our work at that site towards the end of last year. At Box Hill, our department's located off a main thoroughfare of the hospital, and as such, it generated quite a lot of interest of people passing by and seeing our 3D printer in action. However, a few weeks after setting up our lab, I received an email from some concerned folk from the ever-helpful, well-meaning and ever-vigilant Department of Occupational Health and Safety. And they apparently wanted to meet up with me and perform a risk assessment and discuss health and safety issues of my brand new 3D printer. So I was thinking, seriously, I mean, come on, I'm not talking about a high-end specialist device. This is something that you can buy now from Officeworks or Bunnings. I mean, you can even buy it from Audi now for $499. So, what the hell could my 3D printer possibly pose as a risk? But then I thought, okay, look, I'm going to meet up with these guys. I better do my due diligence, and I want to be able to present a measured argument, rather than saying 3D printing good, 2D printing bad. So I started researching to see what potential risks, harms, and negatives 3D printing may have, so I could appropriately respond to any potential queries that they asked me. And so that's what led me to start researching to see the bad and the ugly side of 3D printing, which isn't often talked about because everyone's so excited about this new technology. And that's what I want to share with you today. So the first thing I Googled was 3D printing and death, and I didn't think I'd get a hit, but I did. Thankfully, these were somewhat media sensationalist news reports in which a 3D printer wasn't at fault but just merely present at the time of these deaths, but unfortunately was blamed for the debate. But in the interest of time, I won't go through the details, but I think it's important to note that these two reports get often misquoted as potential dangers of 3D printing. So we just need to be aware of it if we're trying to defend 3D printing from that point of view. As yet, I haven't come across any deaths directly related to 3D printing, so I guess that's pretty promising for our symposium. But the explosion story did, however, lead me towards the issue of the first potential risk of 3D printing, and that is heat and fire risk. Now, from this point, I want to note that my talk is relating to fused deposition modelling of 3D printing. That's the most commonest type of commercially available printers, like the one you saw on the Audi ad before, and that uses a heated nozzle to melt a plastic filament and deposit it layer by layer onto a bed to progressively build up a model. And these printer nozzles can heat the plastic filament anywhere from 190 to 260 degrees Celsius. The build plate that it deposits it on is also up to about 120 degrees. So, we're talking about a device that's using temperatures like our ovens at home. So there is a potential for burning of personnel. Now, our 3D printer, the one on the left here, is in a surrounding enclosure to minimise contact during prints. But, some of the other 3D printers out there don't have that surround. So, look, burns are obviously a risk, and whenever there's a heat, there's also potential for fire as well. So any combustible material, specifically combustible gases that might be found in a hospital setting. For instance, oxygen should be kept well away. So we keep oxygen because we use it for simulation training. And so, you know, these are sort of issues that we didn't really come across or didn't even think about when we started setting up our lab. So heat is used to melt its plastic filaments and lay down fibre, and this causes thermal decomposition of the plastic. This results in the release of vapours or emissions into the surrounding atmosphere. Now, these emissions can be categorised broadly into two main types, volatile organic compounds and ultrafine particles. Now, VOCs are essentially organic chemicals which exist as a vapour at room temperature. And so whilst bonded initially to a substance, say plastic, through a process such as heat, they can be released. So VOCs, they're pretty ubiquitous. I mean, it's what creates most smells and odours, and most of them don't cause any harm. But however, some VOCs can cause health problems, usually through chronic exposure, and this can lead to problems such as skin, eye, or lung irritability, but also more serious effects such as cancer. So benzene, which is the VOC which gives petrol its odour, is an example of one that has been associated with cancer in humans. UFPs, or ultrafine particles, as the name suggests, comprise of small particles, nanometers in size. And the issue with these are inhalation and deposition of these particles into the respiratory system, where they can cause an inflammatory response. So this can lead to lung irritation, coughing and bronchospasm, or exacerbation of airways disease in those with pre-existing lung illness. So UFPs are so small that they can actually penetrate and be absorbed into the circulation, that because of their pro-inflammatory effect, they've been implicated with conditions such as hypertension and stroke. And there's been a lot of recent topical epidemiological research into the population health effects from UFPs in our environment. So where does that lead us with 3D printing? In 2013, there was a landmark paper by Stevens and co. from the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And this was the first study to demonstrate that 3D printers did indeed emit ultrafine particles. Even more worryingly, they thought it was a level that they considered as high, being labelled as a high emitter of ultrafine particles. Another important finding was that printing specifically with ABS plastic, which is a specific type of plastic filament, which is back then in 2013, probably still is now, one of the most commonest filaments being used with 3D printing. That was notoriously associated with release of high levels of UFPs. Of particular interest and usefulness for us is that they also found that PLA plastic, which is another type of plastic filament, significantly produced much less. And I'll talk a little bit of difference between those two filaments in a moment. But what this paper sparked was an initial idea that 3D printers that you can buy from the local corner store may in fact be potentially dangerous to health. Especially as many people are operating these machines in their bedrooms or right next to them in their office or their lab. So this group was sanctioned by the CDC to do a follow-up study. In 2016, they presented their findings, and in this paper, they looked specifically at the VOCs produced from 9 different commercially available test stock printers, and they were able to quantify and identify the VOCs that were produced by different printer filaments. They also reconfirmed that UFPs are indeed released by these printers just with their previous report. The important conclusions from this study was a big highlight that ABS, again, released a VOC called styrene. And this study made a big point of styrene being a cancer-causing substance. And they also noted that this was released in a relatively high amount. They also demonstrated that PLA did produce a VOC called lactide, which they stated was a naturally occurring and safe VOC, and it did so in quite dramatically less amounts. So now we have 2 studies from a respectable group which shows emission of a potentially health-affecting particle, one of which caused the big cancer. And this is what makes the headlines if you look for, dangers of 3D printers. And I'm reading this going, oh crap, I've got to now convince Occupational Health and Safety that this is safe. But since then, there have been several other papers that do support the release of UFPs and VOCs from 3D printers. But if you dig deeper into the facts, there are some areas of contention which are worth noting, which I'm going to highlight. So I'm going to start with UFPs. So despite the scary label that the 2000 report said of being 3D printers causing high emissions of UFPs, the levels are quite similar to everyday activities such as grilling and frying food, for instance. Health agencies actually yet to establish what actually constitutes a safe regulatory level. Numerous studies have also been done to replicate real-life office spaces, and these have different findings in terms of actual UFP amounts. And another study has shown that the actual time average amount of UFP from desktop printers is probably no different from us doing day-to-day activities such as cooking, vacuuming, using your desktop, using your ink printer or your fax machine. Also, the presence of UFPs doesn't actually define that the actual substance, what that consists of. So it's difficult to know what the actual health effect is. For instance, the UFP from PLA, which comes from an organic source, might have a different effect from ABS, which has its origins in petroleum. More research is needed in this area. So coming back to the issue of VOCs and obviously with ABS producing styrene. So yes, Stevens and company were right to correctly label this as a level 2B class carcinogen. This is the ranking given by the International Agency for Research Cancer. Now what that means is a fancy label. It means that it's a possible human carcinogen. This was based on previous animal data, but if you sort of look into the details of styrene, there was a 2016 registry of 72,000 employees of greater than 400 companies exposed to styrene during the production of plastics, and they found no increase in the incidence of cancer. The EPA hasn't given a formal carcinogen ranking to styrene, and to put the IARC into perspective, bacon, salami and red meat actually scores as a more higher chance of causing cancer than the styrene produced by ABS. So it's just interesting to note that. And I still eat red meat. But when people hear the word cancer, it obviously puts fear in their minds. So on top of the question about, that VOC is released, there's also the amount as well. And again, we're getting data coming out that's sort of a bit questionable about what the actual concentrations are and are they actually going to be causing you health problems. On top of VOCs, if you do look, as I did say, PLA produces safe lactide. That's pretty well proven. Some people say, but it also produces other things such as methacrylate. But again, that still doesn't cause any toxicity. There's also wood and nylon filaments, which we don't really use a lot here, but they also produce caprolactam, which is also a safe thing. So ABS kind of looks bad. The other ones, not too sure, but we think they're safe. So let's talk about these two plastics. So ABS plastics is essentially, it stands for acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. So there's no wonder that when it's broken down, it produces styrene. But it's the plastic used to make Lego bricks. It's easy to work with, it's strong, it's a durable plastic polymer, and that's probably the reason why it's still used quite often as the main filament for 3D printing. PLA, on the other hand, is an interesting plastic. It's called a bioplastic, and I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of environmental aspects of it, but it's made actually from corn syrup or cornstarch. When it's printed, it doesn't produce any odors. It's a little bit harder to work with, some people say, than ABS. It's not as strong, it's not as resistant to heat, and the sort of aesthetic quality, some people say, isn't as good as ABS. But the evidence, apart from knowing about the UFPs it produces, the evidence is that the VOCs are probably quite safe from it. So in the last, so maybe these might not be as bad as we initially thought, but we've still got to sort of watch this space. So in the last few years, there have been a slew of other filaments available. So we mentioned NinjaFlex. So that's one that I've been using quite a lot with because it's a flexible polymer. And thankfully, Stevens & Co. have continued to produce data on all the new filaments that are coming out. Luckily, NinjaFlex was included in their 2017 report at the start of January. And thankfully, that shows that the VOC levels and UFP levels are quite low. Thank goodness for that. So there are other options to reduce emissions. You can use things such as a fume hood or extractor, or have a HEPA filter system in place. These obviously cost money for, you know, the amateur 3D printer, but you've got to sort of consider this as an option. Otherwise, these studies, all they've basically said is, look, we don't know the effects. Make sure that you're in a well-ventilated area. Maybe, you know, if you have a position near a window, then it's not as bad. Avoid being in the room if the print is in progress. It's obviously a bit difficult because there are people that have got their 3D printer going non-stop, and as an amateur printer that turns the printer on once a week maybe, then, you know, it's hard to know how to make sense of all these things. But there is ongoing work in this area, and there are new 3D printing filaments on the market now, which are specifically marketed as having low UFP emissions. So I think the sort of like the conclusion from that I get from that is try to use PLA where possible. Luckily, in my practice, that's fine to use. Minimize your exposure by having good ventilation, but, you know, this is one of the uglies that we might need to know, but it might actually not be that bad. So moving on to the next great evil I'll present, it's the environmental impact of 3D printing. So I'm not a huge greenie, but with all the move towards minimising plastic usage and removing plastic bags from supermarkets, the question needs to be posed, are we in fact being bad by heading in the opposite direction and printing all these plastic models? There is a silver lining of sorts, and again we'll mention this idea of bioplastics or eco-friendly plastics, of which PLA is one of them. So PLA is made from cornstarch, as we mentioned, so it's from a renewable source. Now it's biodegradable and compostable, which is its big selling point of being eco-friendly, as it doesn't take hundreds of thousands of years to degrade like ABS. It's non-toxic to humans. You can even eat it. I wouldn't recommend it, but its breakdown components are friendly to both biological organisms and also to the environment. But the kicker is, for it to be biodegradable and compostable requires actually commercial composting with the right conditions, with the right amount of heat, right moisture, and shredding as well. So without these factors, your 3D printed PLA cup is going to sit in the landfill as plastic, and although degrade much faster than ABS, it's still probably going to take a couple of 100 years. So currently, apart from commercial factories dealing with PLA, for the average consumer, there's no real good way to dispose of PLA other than in the trash bin. So unfortunately, at this time, it's not the golden nugget we've been looking for, but there are other environmentally helpful ideas coming onto the market. So there are filament recyclers that are available for purchase. These have come down dramatically in price. For about $1,000 you can get one, and they basically take your old prints, shred them up, melt them, reform them into new rolls of printable filament. And these are desktop size units, and they're becoming a bit more accessible, so maybe that's something we can consider here. Also, the technology to take the old waste and turn them into filaments is actually pretty well established now, and there's a lot of news, feel-good stories about impoverished communities around the world collecting their trash and converting it into 3D printer filaments. So I think the environmental impact, look, it's there. We need to be mindful of it. There's looks like there's some promising sort of steps and ventures heading our way. Because of time, I'm not going to go through all the uglies and things that are possible, but just as a quick mention, unfortunately, experimentation and failure. Our 3D printers, at least my one, isn't perfect. It's far from perfect. The technology is getting better year by year. So we still have a lot of print failures. We have this lovely, beautiful mess that we made after returning after 6 hours and say, oh, what a waste of time and money. But, you know, it's going to happen with 3D printing. But the technology is going to get better, and I really believe that. And so I just urge you, if you're having these problems, to just keep trialing and trying and trying. And hopefully we can get to where David is and his team and get to a fruitful venture. But there are also legality, IP issues and copyright issues. Again, I'm not going to go too much into it. There's also ethical considerations and controls, who should and who can print what. I'm going to leave this for Luke Hemsberger, who's going to follow me, who's probably going to touch a little bit on these issues. I've mentioned difficulty in publishing. Like, the difficulty for us is it's hard to make multi-center randomized controlled trials, and so a lot of journals out there don't really want your novel little venture. But, you know, I think we really need to keep pushing the research out there to increase awareness of 3D printing in medicine. I don't endorse these, but I just want to mention that they're there. There are 2 journals out there, a 3D Printing in Medicine by Springer Group, and also there's a journal of 3D Printing in Medicine. Now, as I said, I don't endorse them. I know that there are predatory journals out there just to make money, but looking at these, they seem reasonable. They are there to seem to genuinely want to promote this technology. So, look, hopefully my intention today is I'm an amateur 3D printing researcher, and I hope some of you might be interested in 3D printing research as well. There are some sides of 3D printing that we don't want to talk about, but we need to address, and hopefully I've helped educate a little bit about that, and then you can continue to champion for 3D printing in medicine. Thank you very much.